Hi, my name's Sam Browse. I'm an activist for the Rise Festival and a regular contributor to Arise's sister publication, Labour Outlook. I'd like to welcome everyone tuning into this event discussing Marx and multipolarity. The event today is part of Rise Festival's monthly Marx Matters series. We've already seen thousands of you register for talks, including today and the two that came before, one with Michael Roberts and another with Paul LeBlanc on the relevance of Marxist economic thinking to today and on Lenin, respectively. You can catch up with those on the Arise YouTube channel, and I'd really encourage you to do that as well. Coming up too, we have a session on Marx and Ireland and much more besides in 2026 with speakers including Grace Blakely and John Trickett. And while I'm talking about future events, I should also highlight our forthcoming Engels lecture at the end of November with August Nimitz. You can find links to how to register for that in the chat as well. Before I go any further, I'm just going to hand over to Ben Hayes, an Arise Festival volunteer, to talk more about Arise and tell you a little bit about our forthcoming events too. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks to everyone joining us today. It's great to be with you virtually. The work of the Marx Matters series is entirely volunteer funded and conducted, so we are reliant on your support. And if you're able to help us with these events, the link will be in the chat, and it's all very much appreciated. As Sam said, the next event in the Marx Matters series is with Jim McVeigh from the James Connolly Visitor Centre in Belfast. That'll be me more information. How you can register for that in the chat, and it'll be a highly productive discussion. I think that's all the information you need. Is there anything else I'm missing?
That sounds great to me, Ben. Thanks so much. But yeah, like I said, as Ben said, it'd be great if you could donate at the link provided. Also, just to highlight too, one last bit of housekeeping, and I think it would kind of be remiss of me not to mention this too. But our Marx Matters season tickets, as Ben said, these events cost money to run in terms of the fees for using the tech and advertising and all the rest of it. So for that reason, while these events are free, we'd really encourage you to purchase a Marx Matters season ticket just to help us continue running them. And of course, you can also make a donation too, as Ben said. With all that now having been said, today we're joined by Radhika Desai to talk about Marx and multipolarity and ask a key question: how does Marx help us to understand today's geopolitics? And what a time to ask that question too, with all that's happening across the globe. A genocide having taken place in front of the eyes of the world, war in Eastern Europe, a US war fleet off the coast of Venezuela, and the rise of new economic powers against American-led imperialism. One of the core ideas of Marxism is that capitalism is an expanding world system. So today, then, we're asking what's the relationship between that world system and the tumultuous geopolitics we are seeing and have seen? And to help us answer that question is Professor Radhika Desai, an academic at the University of Manitoba, director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, and the author of books and articles on issues ranging from geopolitical economy, imperialism, nationalism, the coronavirus, nuclear weapons, and much, much more. So I'm going to hand over to Radhika now for a short intro talk, and then we'll go to some questions. Thanks so much for joining us today, Radhika. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Sam, and everyone else. Thanks also to the Arise Festival for asking me to speak to you. I'm very happy to do that. I think I want to be part of any movement that spreads radical socialist and Marxist ideas. So your question to me is, how does Marx help us to explain what you call geopolitics? I prefer to use the term international relations because because geopolitical economy, in fact, is precisely a term which I coined in order to contest the idea that there is such a thing as a economics separate from society and separate from politics and so on, which is a post-Marxist and in many ways an anti-Marxist idea. And therefore, it's really geopolitical economy in one sense is also an attack, a criticism of what I call the contemporary social scientific division of labor, in which we study society in these separate disciplines, which are moreover not historical. So geopolitical economy wishes to return to a way of thinking which was native to Marx, which was also largely native to classical political economy, in which you think of society as a whole and as a historically evolving whole, particularly in the case of capitalism, because capitalism being contradictory, the contradictions essentially form the motor that drive it forward. If it was not contradictory, it could be more stable, more, shall we say, even static, but it isn't. It is inherently a dynamic system. And then so I came to write geopolitical economy. Initially, as I started writing it, my conception of what I was doing radically changed, because originally it was supposed to be a critique of the idea of globalization. And in order to critique that idea, I was going to use the idea of US hegemony. But the more I tried to operationalize the idea in order to work with it, I realized that, in fact, it doesn't work. US hegemony also does not work. There are so many different definitions. There are as many definitions as there are writers, if not more, because, of course, individual writers keep shifting their definitions as well. And I ultimately realized that this thesis does not make sense. It does not hold water. It does not stand up to the evidence. So eventually, geopolitical economy became a critique of what I ended up calling cosmopolitan ideas of the world economy. Basically, Friedrich List called it that as well. This idea that the world economy is a seamless whole, whether under free market, free trade, or globalization discourses, it is unified by markets alone, or it is unified, as in hegemony, ideas of hegemony and US hegemony, it is unified by a single state. But either way, the world economy is conceived of as a whole. Now, this then also brings me to the problems I had with most Marxist approaches. So, there is such a thing as Marxist international relations. And, undoubtedly, the people who write in Marxist international relations are all very erudite scholars and so on. But unfortunately, what they have to say is also not very Marxist. And the reason, and I ended up also sort of in the course of writing geopolitical economy, and since then, I've ended up creating a new field of study, the field of study in which I investigate exactly how current Marxism, Western Marxism, so-called Marxist economics, actually deviates from Marxism. And I trace it all back to the point where neoclassical economics emerges in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And in doing so, what it does is it establishes a sphere called the economy, which is separated from society and politics and so on. And it thinks of this sphere largely in static terms, because the notion of contradiction is eliminated. So any serious dynamism is eliminated from the system. And unfortunately, what has happened in the period since is that you've had the development of a Marxist economics. You would have thought, especially given that neoclassical economics from the get-go, particularly in its Austrian version, was so stridently anti-socialist and even anti-Marxist, you'd have thought that Marxists would have taken up cudgels against it. But unfortunately, apart from criticizing neoclassical economics for ignoring the exploitation of workers, for the rest, they tried to fit Marxism into neoclassical economics. But the two ways of thinking are substantially and methodologically totally opposed. Marxists think in terms of value and so on, and neoclassical economics has no concept of value. It only has a concept of price and so on. And there are many other such differences. So unfortunately, Bukharin called this a policy of theoretical reconciliation. That's what Marxists were doing. And this gives rise to so-called Marxist economics, in which rather than using Marxism to criticize neoclassical economics, which, as I say, they did only on one count, which is that neoclassical economics ignored labor exploitation. But for the rest, they actually used neoclassical economics to indict Marxism. And there are at least three accusations that have been made, and these go back to actually the work in the 1880s and 1890s of Tugan von Baranovsky, who was a Russian legal Marxist, that is to say, a not very radical Marxist, because he was allowed to publish legally in Tsarist Russia, which was otherwise heavily censored, in which scholarship was heavily censored. So these guys, they raised three objections, and even to this day, most people, and the overwhelming majority of people who call themselves Marxist economics, will raise at least one of these three objections against Marx. Number one, that his work suffers from a transformation problem. Number two, that Marx didn't think that there were demand deficits, whereas in fact the evidence is all over the place, all over capital and so on. And number three, that he was wrong about the falling rate of profit. So in one form or another, these things manifest themselves. So the point is that because of this kind of policy of theoretical reconciliation and the existence of Marxist economists, then what also happens is that the other disciplines, so you have Marxist sociology and Marxist whatever and Marxist international relations, they also end up accepting what Marxist economists say about Marx's analysis of capitalism. And since they are, which is that it suffers from all these problems. And so they are essentially, we are barred from actually connecting with Marx's legacy, which is a legacy in which Marx conceives of capitalism as contradictory value production, all three words being important. So in international relations, you have people who either say that Marx was the first theorist of globalization, which is not true. You know, they basically rely on certain passages, particularly in the manifesto, in which, you know, there is these practically this lionization of the bourgeoisie, in which, you know, the bourgeoisie creates this world economy, etc. But just a couple of pages down from that paean of whatever, you know, this idea that capitalism creates this kind of global economy. Just a couple of pages down, you have Marx and Engels saying how capitalism also requires the creation of a nation state and a national economy, which will be, you know, and how the struggle of the working classes in the first instance against their own bourgeoisie, etc., etc. So essentially, they either say that Marx was the best theorist of globalization, or they fall for some version of US hegemony discourse, or they even look for how Marxism is a good structural account, but it does not it's not sufficiently realist, and so on. So all of this Marxist international relations was for me also very unsatisfactory. So I essentially went back to Marx and found in Marx a number of things that have helped me to create at least the basic foundation for a Marxist approach to what Marx called the relations of producing nations. Now, this is very interesting because they are not just nations that can be thought about in terms of, culture or language or what have you. These are producing nations. So the way in which material life is organized in every country is very central to it. So he talks about the relations of producing nations, and what I'm calling geopolitical economy is in fact the relations of producing nations. And Marx also, very interestingly, he doesn't use the term capitalist nations. He uses the term producing nations because he's very aware that, yes, in his time, the world has become dominated by the capitalist nations, but there are also pre-capitalist nations, and there will be post-capitalist nations. So in that sense, it's a complex system that you have to understand, where the bulk of its dynamism, and particularly the bulk of its imperialism, comes from the major capitalist countries. So they are the fount and origin of all the IR problems, the wars, the genocide, everything that you were talking about, including, of course, the two world wars that we have experienced in the last century. So in that sense, I don't see capitalism as an inherently expansionist system. I see it as an inherently imperialist system. And also then what geopolitical economy also does is it roots the dynamism of the international system in the contradictions of capitalism. It is the contradictions of capitalism that, first of all, require, right from the get-go and continuing throughout the existence of capitalism, the state, the capitalist state, to play a central role in managing the contradictions. These contradictions can then be managed by a domestic action, whether it is making political concessions to the working class or regulating capitalism or expanding demand or whatever it may be. We have known historically many ways in which bailouts, of course, in our own time. All of these are forms of intervention without which I also argue that capitalism would have never survived. I mean, this idea that capitalism, apart from an original revolution which lays the foundation, does not, of capitalism, does not need the state to manage it. Actually, left to itself, the capitalist system would have destroyed itself very, very early on. It requires capitalist states to manage them on an active basis and on an ongoing basis, with each new intervention introducing new layers of complication in the system. So it's not an expansionist system in that kind of globalization sense. It's an imperialist system because, in addition to those domestic actions that I was just listing, capitalist states will also undertake international actions to manage their contradictions. So the international actions are aimed at essentially trying to get a subordinated periphery to pay the cost of managing capitalism's contradictions. And so imperialism then is once more placed at the core of understanding the international relations of the age of capital, or the relations of producing nations in the age of capital. So to me, this is also very important and interesting because, again, international relations is dominated by these traditions like realism. Realism is just a justification for the aggression of the United States and other imperialist countries. It is not really a theory of how states deal with each other. It cannot understand how socialist states have historically dealt with one another. Anyway, so this is there is imperialism. Now, in the interest of time, I will try to keep this short, but let me just say that imperialism itself is contradictory because, on the one hand, it's contradictory in two ways. On the one hand, it requires that the subordinated periphery be prosperous enough and stable enough to accept capitalism's excess commodities and excess capital. On the other hand, it requires the periphery to be so poor as to yield up its commodities and its labor for very cheap, so that the capitalist countries can get cheap inputs, cheap raw materials, cheap wage goods, cheap food from these countries, and so on. And of course, the poverty also means that they remain suppliers of labor. Marx always talked about a reserve army of labor. Today, the largest part of the reserve army of labor is in the third world, and Marx would have understood that very well. So it's contradictory in this way, and then it's contradictory in another way, because, of course, when you have this kind of imperial subordination, what you have is a system in which, in the imperialist countries, you get a sort of development which is reliant precisely on the underdevelopment, the de-development of the subordinated periphery. Now, when you have this situation, and this also, by the way, means that development is also at the center of understanding the international relations of capitalism. It's really about the development of the productive capacities of entire societies. So imperialism seeks to deny this development to the subordinated periphery, and those parts of the subordinated periphery, or those parts threatened with such subordination, will resist. So what you had, so to me, the way in which you understand how the world, became industrialized, outside the original core of industrialization in the UK, is that territories that were threatened by such imperial subordination undertook state-directed industrialization, protectionist state-directed industrialization, as in the case of the United States or Germany or Japan, which were the first countries to develop against the domination, against British domination of the world market. And when you have, when this happens, so by doing this, I'm also doing one other thing, which is I'm bringing that whole tradition of thinking about how development actually takes place, not under free markets and not under imperialism as some Warrenite Marxists would believe, but rather through state-directed development, as in the three cases I mentioned. And more recently, of course, a lot has been written about the development of South Korea, Taiwan, etc. And of course, of which the socialist countries are also examples. China is, of course, the most magnificent example today of such state-directed development. So I'm putting this entire developmental state theorization next to Marxism, which is again something that on the whole has not been done. The developmental state theorists don't touch Marxism with a barge pole, and the Marxists don't touch the developmental state theorists with a barge pole. So that's what you have on the whole. I mean, okay, so I put this there. So essentially, then what you've had is this. Initially, these countries resisted, and of course, their development could be capitalist because at the time that they were developing, there were still to be had weak states or territories with weak states or no states that could be taken over and subordinated. So you got this towards the end of the 19th and in the early 20th century, you got this competition for colonies, which of course lay at the root of the big capitalist crisis. So this dialectic between the imperial domination and resistance to it is, Trotsky gave it a name. He called it uneven and combined development, although he was never happy with this expression. He said, this is the best I could come up with, fine. But in Marxism, it's, in Marx also, you find a recognition that this will happen. For example, if you read the essays that Marx and Engels wrote around in the mid-1840s on the free trade debates, you will see that they are very clear that while at that particular moment they supported free trade because they thought it would accelerate capitalism, they also realized that if protection were to do the same, as it was promising to do in Germany at a later stage, that they would, protection would soonest bring capitalism to a crisis. It would develop the working class, etc., etc. So they were both possible. So I join these together. But this dialectic itself forms the second contradiction of imperialism, which is that imperialism can seek to subordinate the periphery, but the periphery is not going to necessarily take it lying down. It will resist. And in the first phase of resistance, you got these forms of capitalist development. But of course, as Lenin pointed out, by 1914, the world had been divided up among the major capitalist countries. And now only redivision would take place. And you got, of course, the war of redivision in the First World War. And you also got something else, which is that it was not perhaps surprising that this First World War and the 30 years crisis that it inaugurated, between 1914 and 1945, this huge crisis of capitalism and imperialism was bookended by the two greatest communist revolutions we have known, namely the Russian and the Chinese. And so what you then got was a new pattern of development, which was qualitatively different from anything that had gone before it. And it was different in at least three ways, possibly four ways. Number one, they had to develop from a point to which they had been set back by imperialism. They were no longer at a kind of neutral starting line. They had been pushed back from that. So they had further to go in their own industrialization and development. Number two, they had to do it without the privilege of imperialism. They could not impose the costs of their own development on some subordinated periphery. And number three, they had to do it in the teeth of imperialist resistance. And in fact, more recently, I was thinking about it, and one would add a further point, which is, of course, that the European societies also had the privilege of exporting their surplus labor to the rest of the world, so that today there are 3.5 continents on which the descendants of Europeans live, where they did not live before. Whereas the countries that industrialize today will not have those privileges. So so these are the ways in which these countries' developments is necessarily different. And I would argue that because imperialism is not possible in any substantial way. I'm not excluding the possibility that big countries like India or Brazil may dominate a few small countries, but none of the kind of systemic and systemically large forms of imperialism are possible anymore. And so what you have found is that, barring exceptions like South Korea and Taiwan, which were exceptions because they were frontline states against communism, the only countries that have delivered to their populations standards of living that are remotely comparable to those that are obtainable in the West are the socialist countries. And I'm thinking primarily here of the Soviet Union and the PRC today. And it's not surprising. So I'm going to come to an end now. So, but to close my talk, I mean, this is how I would understand multipolarity. So multipolarity is essentially a process through which countries engaging in state-directed development against imperialism have spread productive power around the world. Productive power has not spread through globalization. It has not spread through imperialism. It has not spread through hegemony. It has spread through opposition to all of these three things. And I think the countries that have succeeded best have been the socialist countries. This is not to say that countries like Mexico or Brazil or India have not experienced substantial industrialization, but they will always remain weaker compared to the substantial achievements of the socialist countries, primarily because they remain capitalist and the options for capitalist development are relatively limited. So in a certain sense, I guess one of the ways I also think about it is that, and this is my final point, in Marxism, we tend to think, or most Western Marxists tend to think of socialism arriving after capitalism has prevailed over the whole world in some one loud thunderclap when the whole world will become socialist. Well, that's not how it's going to happen. First of all, capitalism must necessarily fail to develop the whole world, which then means that you can have imperialism, socialism not only can, but possibly has to start in the relatively less developed countries and spread and because as a form of development, essentially. And that's what you've seen so far in the history of socialism. And so different countries will progress towards socialism in their own way. And of course, as socialism spreads, as it must, because capitalism is no longer a way of developing, then you will get the possibility of creating mutually beneficial relations among socialist countries, relations of solidarity among socialist countries, which will then progress humanity further and faster towards better material, towards development, towards socialism, and so on. So I guess I'll end there. But this is the general vision in which multipolarity, or what Hugo Chavez used to call pluripolarity, is just part of the path to socialism, the international part of the path.
Thanks for that, Radhika. That was a really kind of rich beginning to the conversation. There's so many things to kind of get kind of teeth into. I think I have a lot of questions actually about your kind of the initial the sort of initial exposition of your kind of own framework and where it came from in terms of actually, but it'd be good to about the kind of relationship between that and academic institutions and how you're kind of forced as a radical to kind of interact with a sort of disciplinary field, which is kind of set by the institution. But what I would like to get involved in is kind of some of the meatier stuff. You were talking about the sort of mechanics of the mechanics of kind of global capitalism and imperialism, and I think that idea of the relations of producing nations is a kind of interesting one, because I think in your book, I think it was Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, you talk explicitly about actually within that kind of capitalist camp of there being sort of varied different types of capitalisms, and kind of you contrast the sort of financialized US, UK kind of models with like Germany, with Japan. I wondered if you would talk a little bit more about that and the contradictions that sort of produces in that camp, because it seems to be kind of sort of the essence of what you're talking about in terms of those relationships between nations as well.
the best way to understand this, at one level, of course, lots of people have pointed out that there are different types of capitalism, and that there is this Anglo-American version, which is kind of more liberal, and so on. And then there have been all these other ones. And by the way, this is very close to the idea of combined development, because in combined development, you always are looking at state-directed development. And when you have state-directed development in each country, the particular form that capitalism will take will come out of its own geographical situation, historical development, and institutional development, and so on. So you have had French capitalism is different from German, is different from Japanese, is different from Swedish, etc., etc. And even the United States, at one point in its history, so early on, it is very much in this tradition of state-directed development. I think the United States, and part of the madness behind Trump's tariffs is that the United States at one point got nearly all its revenues from tariffs, until the early 20th century. So it was, and what's his name? Trump is thinking, he's sort of fantasizing, isn't that great? Everybody else will pay the taxes for the United States. Of course, tariffs are paid by US consumers, but that's another matter. But anyway, so you have these things. But the more I've thought about it, I think that especially looking at what's happening in Europe now, at least by some accounts, what has happened in Japan, etc. You see, the path towards keeping your economy more industrially focused, as Germany was even until, say, a decade or so ago, Japan is still in many ways, is that you have to control capital to some extent, and you cannot permit the financial system in particular to become what it has become in the UK and the United States, where it is no longer geared towards productive investment. Now, when you do that, of course, you have a situation in which you are essentially controlling capital. And at some level, in such a situation, it would be a lot easier for working people. Like if there were a political party of the working class, then it would be easier for them to take over this national capital. In a certain sense, the nationalization of capital, an industrial capital, would make it easier to essentially transition to socialism. What you have in the US and the UK, on the contrary, is that they, instead of incurring this danger, they are more willing to incur another danger, which is that you essentially create a highly financialized form of capitalism in which you sacrifice your own productive base. And of course, in so doing, the danger that you are creating is that of the crashing of the financial system, in which then, from which then you are unable to emerge. So what you have in the US and the UK in particular is a type of capitalism that is able to give its own working people a much less good form of life. They have greater inequality, they have less public provision, etc., etc. So comparatively speaking, working people are in a worse situation there. Whereas in the case of Japan or Germany, they are still, even after after the last couple of decades during which they have been coming closer to the UK-US system, they are still relatively better off. Exactly which way they will go depends, but I think the outcome in either case would have to be would be some kind of socialism, because in a productive national capitalism, an industrially productive national capitalism, working people can take it over more easily, or because working people will be driven essentially to rejecting a system which, in fact, they won't even have to reject it. The system is simply unable to provide for themselves, and working people will simply have to say, okay, if it can't provide for us, we'll have to construct one that will provide. So either way, there can be two different or more than two different forms of through which these countries will arrive at socialism. I wonder if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, that's kind of actually to have a sort of two dynamics still. On the one hand, that internal contradiction. It was actually going to lead me to my next question, where you said that capitalism in your beginning presentation, like capitalism must fail to develop the whole the whole world. And the follow-up question I was going to be asked, which you've kind of touched on there, was like, to what extent is it even developing, the sort of belly of the beast at the moment, and so yeah, I guess that from there follows that how much road do you think there is left, from what you're, I mean, in places like. We've like been on these calls before, and we've talked about things like the morbid symptoms of everything that's going on right now, and Trump being, Trump and like Nigel Farage in the UK being a kind of, and as you were talking too, I wondered too, notwithstanding the kind of developments around the AfD in Germany, but perhaps, well, no, I guess to the extent to which it's that what you're describing explains sort of the acuteness of those far right political projects in each of those kind of nation states too. But yeah, I guess my question.
I mean, morbid symptoms is, of course, a phrase that keeps coming back.
Yeah.
Gramsci got it so right. But here's the thing. In fact, your question reminds me of an element that I didn't include in my opening remarks, and it's very relevant, particularly given the centrality of the question you're asking. So I would, if you read Marx, particularly Volume 3. There is a very clear, there's a discussion in one of the chapters, I think it's chapter 27 or something, the role of credit in production and so on. But in this place, Marx basically discusses very explicitly the following thesis, that once capitalism arrives at the monopoly phase, and I developed this in Capitalism, Coronavirus and War as well, once capitalism arrives at the monopoly phase, it will have become ripe for socialism. For a very simple reason, is because once capitalism loses its competitive dynamic, it loses the dynamic that has made it develop the forces of production, albeit it developed them brutally, anarchically, chaotically, etc. But in its own way, it did develop, and now it will not even do that. Plus, people will see when they look at these massified apparatuses of production, which will be the result, which will inevitably take a rise in monopoly capitalism. They say the labor that produces this is social. And social labor should be owned by society. Also, there is the critique of monopolies itself. Why should monopolies be privately owned? They should be publicly owned. So that should have been. So Marx is already saying this, well before he died. He in the 1870s and 1880s, when he's drafting the manuscripts that eventually became Capital Volume 3. And of course, he is not wrong. He is living in a time where monopoly is beginning to appear. The concentration and centralization of capital is definitely picking up pace. So why should he not say that? And then, if you read Lenin, I actually recently wrote a paper called "Lenin Was Right About the Higher Stage of Capitalism," because, people always dismiss this claim of Lenin's. But actually, if you read it's worthwhile, rereading that text, Imperialism, the Higher Stage of Capitalism, because if you read it, keeping in mind what Marx says in Volume 3 about monopoly, you realize that Lenin is simply developing that point and saying, what Marx was saying earlier is true, and it's becoming more true every day. And we are living in those times that Marx said, in which it is ripe for transition to socialism. So if you take this seriously, we are actually paying the cost of keeping capitalism alive more than a century past its sell-by date. And you see, Lenin was not alone. There were other people too in the 1920s and 30s and so on. In the 1930s, for example, Alvin Hansen wrote about secular stagnation. By the time the Second World War was going to end, people like, or even Keynes, for that matter, in the 1930s, and certainly by the 40s, and people like Karl Polanyi, they all thought that by the time the Second World War ended, that the world would shift radically to the left. And then you got the golden age, and all these Marxists, so-called Marxists, because they're really, I would say sometimes, I think they are the worshippers of capital, because they are constantly saying that capital has the capacity to constantly regenerate itself. Yeah, it's bad, it's terrible for working people, but you know what, it can go on forever. And that's because they have forgotten what Marx said, that capitalism is contradictory. They don't believe in contradictions. They think that contradictions, there are no economic contradictions, and only sort of a sheer act of will on the part of the working class will create socialism, which is complete rubbish. So I think that capitalism is breaking down before our eyes. It is no longer, but you see, they point to the golden age and say, see, capitalism revived itself. Look at it. But first of all, when we talk about golden age growth, we are talking about world growth. To this world growth, the socialist countries, which were growing at a very fast clip in these decades, made a contribution. So did the developing countries, which were all undertaking at that time distinctly left-leaning forms of development, national autonomous development, etc. And number three, of course, in the first world countries themselves, you had Keynesian welfare states, which involved reforms to capitalism, which, as Hobsbawm points out, would have been rejected as socialist previously, but now it was forced on them. So it was this, and these things put together vastly expanded demand around the world. And by doing that, created conditions in which, for about 30 years, capitalism went on. But the thing is, underlying the system in the First World was still capitalist. It eventually ran into crisis by the 1970s. And instead of saying that the way out of this crisis is to deepen those socialist reforms, which I think very few people said, and if they said it, they did not say it with enough conviction. And so the right wing won. They said the problems are these reforms. We are going to roll them back, and capitalism is going to get its mojo back. But you can't. When you give freedom to competitive capital, you can get perhaps that result. But when you give freedom to monopoly capital, you do not see any of the virtues of competitive capitalism and only the vices of monopoly. Rentier incomes, financialization, low rates of investment, low rates of innovation, low rates of growth, you name it. And all of this has plagued us. So actually, we really have to wake up to the fact that we have been putting up with capitalism for far too long. And at least one of the reasons, and I'm not saying this is the only reason, but at least one of the reasons is because this compromise with neoclassical economics gave us a Schumpeterian rather than a Marxist conception of capitalism, in which capitalism is capable of going on forever, developing the whole world, never ceasing to innovate, etc. And all of these things are manifestly wrong. And Schumpeter and his account of capitalism does not hold water. So this idea that capitalism, can run basically as a market system, that it has no contradictions, that if there are problems, it will self-regenerate, as Schumpeter said, these are all problematic concepts. And so how much road does capitalism have left? I think it ran out of road a long time ago. The question is, when will we realize it and do something about it?
That's I guess too, actually, and in terms of that framework you put forward, actually the greater the crisis and the more sort of political responsibility that those the states of those producing nations take on for actually basically rescuing capitalism, the more kind of politically exposed they become to a movement who says, look, we don't want to pay for this anymore. Absolutely.
Yeah, and in the Britain particularly, because I've been spending a lot of time in London recently, and I just find myself aghast at how much punishment people are willing to take. I mean, you have a system in which right now the November budget is going to be really a crunch point, because Rachel Reeves and the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, won office by saying they're not going to raise taxes and so on. And they have already raised taxes. Now they're going to raise taxes even more. But all the sirens' voices are saying you can't tax rich people. So what are they going to do? They're going to tax already poor people more? This is and plus, you have a wages crisis, you have a housing crisis, you have a water crisis, you have a situation in which monopoly companies are squeezing the revenues of the state, which are collected on the basis of an extremely regressive system of taxation. So I'm still astonished that places even like the BBC, which is supposed to be, I know it's pretty right-wing, but I'm just astonished how right-wing it is, because they talk about Thames Water, which is one of the biggest scandals. If anything should be nationalized with very little compensation, only compensation to the widows and not to the fat cats, metaphorically speaking. this should have been on the agenda a long time ago, but the people are speaking knowledgeably, very thoughtfully on the BBC about how, these things happen and we have to learn how to deal with them, and the state should, blah, blah, and so on. And I just find that astonishing. I don't know how long people in the UK will take this punishment.
Yeah, I was going to say that's really interesting, because it brings us onto the idea of resistance. And in the UK, certainly, one of the biggest resistance movements we've had to the government is on the issue of Palestine. And actually, what you're kind of talking about sort of makes sense, in that you've got, I think sometimes there's I would say that is an anti-capitalist resistance, and that's one of the biggest kind of resistance to imperial foreign policy we've had in Britain, I think probably ever, like in terms of like the magnitude, size of the demonstrations coming out on the streets regularly. But I mean, that framework that you put in place, where as you have this resistance from the periphery, like, and the exploited, at this growing at the same time as you have this sort of run out of road capitalism domestically, you can see that there's the opportunity for those, like, the solidarity movements to kind of flower and develop. And certainly, like I say, as someone who was involved in the Palestine solidarity movement, it was a thing that I kind of cut my teeth on, when I was a student, as an activist. Things have never, whilst the policy of the government is atrocious in terms of the actual wider views and opinions of where people are at, it's never been more sort of commonplace, to express your solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinian people. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how this framework fits in with, like, an analysis of what's happening in Palestine, the Trump's deal and all the rest of it. How does that fit into the framework you've offered?
I mean, I personally feel that there are, obviously, first of all, let me say that, congratulations to the whole Palestine solidarity movement for the wonderful resistance they have been putting up. I think this is very important, particularly in the imperialist countries, in the belly of the beast, etc. But I really feel that the situation of Palestine will not change. I mean, and while I agree that we should have this form of solidarity, I want to say two things. Number one, the situation of the situation in places like Palestine, other subordinated parts of the world, will not change unless we change our governments. The governments in London and Washington are changed. And I think that in many ways that should be perhaps our most important. We should replace these governments with governments that are willing to be anti-imperialist. I mean, that's the first thing. Secondly, without at all denying the value of the actions that are taking place in the street, they are important. The second thing I want to say is that if we take seriously the fact, and this is seriously the point, that our prosperity in places like the UK or the US depends on, and this is a prosperity that is rapidly diminishing for a lot of us, but nevertheless, to the extent that we have certain kinds of prosperity, it is reliant on the poverty of the rest of the world. And so, and you see, for a long time, but this particular type of Marxist economics that we've had, which lionizes capitalism and so on, it has told us that capitalism is going to solve the problems of production. But as we can see, capitalism does not solve the problem of production. Capitalism is today creating a situation, has left countries like the UK and the US in particular, especially the Anglo model countries, in a situation where they are unable to produce what they need. And so actually a socialist society will have to roll up its sleeves and look at the problem of production. How are we going to produce what we need, and how are we going to exchange it for what we need from the rest of the world? These are going to become, once again, very fundamental questions. This problem became particularly apparent when we had COVID, and because of the supply chains being disrupted and so on, because we have become reliant on these far-flung supply chains, which in which it is better to, subject somebody to miserly wages rather than to have a well-trained workforce at home, which is capable of producing at a high level of productivity to allow it to have a decent standard of living, etc., etc. We are not undertaking those hard tasks. So, and that's why, to me, I think that you're going to have a thing on Engels. One of the things I love about what Engels had written is his whole essay on the role of force in history, because I think the extent to which we think that, you can isolate war from basic productive capacities, it's in a variety of complex ways, these are deeply connected. So I think that both of these things are important. Number one, if you want to attack imperialism, attack the imperialist government. And I'll say one final thing, which is that our governments have greater capacity to resist us, to suppress us, because they are imperialist. So imperialism, there's a good reason for ordinary folks in first world countries to resist imperialism, because their anti-capitalist resistance will not work unless it is also anti-imperialist resistance. Because as long as these governments draw sustenance from their imperial tentacles, as long as these ruling classes draw sustenance from their imperial hold over the rest of the world, they are that much more powerful and more capable of suppressing us and dividing us and all those things.
No, absolutely. I wondered actually, just because it'll be before we conclude, you've got time for a couple more questions. But you mentioned COVID, and actually, again, the sort of the discourse in Britain compared to like the rest of the world, I think around COVID, there were lots of people who sort of said, "Oh, this hails the end of like neoliberalism because we've had these massive interventions." And obviously, while that was happening, you had an attack on living standards in Britain, in the US, in the imperialist countries, but also across the world, vaccine apartheid, and all of these issues. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the coronavirus and how that shaped the kind of system we live in now, and what it kind of exemplifies in terms of in terms of that system.
Yeah, actually, it's funny that the book Capitalism, Coronavirus and War had its origins in an essay I wrote the first weekend we were shut down. We were told one Thursday, I arrived for my usual classes, and I was told that, oh, well, this is your last class. You're not coming back next week. You will do your classes by this thing called Zoom. I hadn't even really understood what Zoom was. And then you see, and I had just earlier that year made an agreement with Canadian Dimension, the very well-known journal here, left-wing journal, that I would give them one article a month on some or the other international geopolitical economic theme, etc. And so Sai, the editor, is writing to me saying, "Where's your article?" So I said, "Okay, I got to write about this." And I had been following the whole financial and economic aspect of the crisis for some time. So, I had noticed that the Federal Reserve had been pumping vast quantities of money into the financial system, and so on and so forth. So that weekend, after sort of, doing a crash course on what this COVID was and so on for myself, I wrote a paper which was called, what was it called now? I mean, I wrote a short article about, the unexpected reckoning, capitalism and coronavirus, in which I argued that essentially, for the last many decades, capitalism had been embarked on this neoliberal road, and that it had only weakened capitalism productively. So the coronavirus situation, the problem was going to do two things. Number one, it was going to expose the inequalities of capitalism, because of course those who were privileged could go home into their very nice homes, etc., and then those who were not would be shut up in tiny flats or rooms or whatever, with God knows what would happen with them, etc., etc. And I said that, so it would expose that, and I said it would worsen the already deep problems with the productive capacities of capitalism. And it would do a third thing, which is that it would show that our capacity to deal with these problems, our political capacity to deal with these problems, will be found to be woefully wanting, because already by then we had people like Trump in office, Boris Johnson had just become the prime minister, etc. So the point is that we have these jokers as leaders. Like, what are they going to do? They're not going to be able to cope with the crisis. We don't have even so for all of these reasons. The coronavirus is going to do all these things, and I think it's largely been borne out. We have gone from bad to worse, where we went from Johnson to Liz Truss, for crying out loud. So and Biden wasn't much better in the interim. So that's one part of the answer. And the second part of the answer is, you see, when people said that neoliberalism is dead. Look at this extent of state intervention. They forget two things. Number one, states have always intervened. Like I said, this is part of the primary tenets of geopolitical economy. States have always intervened. In fact, you see, you have to understand the discourse of neoclassical economics, of neoliberalism, that the state should not intervene, that will be a big mess if it will, blah, blah, etc. This discourse, it's not surprising at all that this discourse does not arise until the working class becomes, and it promises to become, a major force in European politics. Because up until then, states did all kinds of things to help capital, and there was no problem. But when the working class emerges capable of saying to the state, okay, you're doing this for them, what about doing this for us? That's when it becomes important to say, the economy is its own sphere, you should not interfere with it, blah, blah, etc. And so neoliberalism, and the second thing is that neoliberalism emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century. It kind of got into its own. It emerges at this time, talking about competition and markets precisely at the historical moment when capitalism was becoming monopoly. They say nothing about that. In fact, they try to cover it up. And in fact, they also work against the antitrust legislation that had been enacted in the United States and water it down and so on. That is, so neoliberalism has never been about markets and competition. It has always been about giving freedom to capital, which is by now monopoly capital, which will, as I say, not take this freedom to exhibit any kind of productive dynamism, but indulge in the vices of monopoly. And that's what we are seeing. So neoliberalism has not ended because capital is still being helped by the state. In fact, in Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, I say that at this point we have two rather bad options. One is, if you have a kind of Bidenite option, you will get essentially a type of neoliberalism, which I call pseudo-civic. So under that, the state will essentially pay big private corporations to produce certain goods and services, whether it is vaccines or transportation or whatever it may be, water, whatever. The state will pay them piles of money to produce this at huge margins, huge profit margins. And the public will get a poorer and poorer quantity and quality of these goods and services. But this will all be done in the name of how, the state is going to provide for the people. And at the same time, the best way of producing these things is in the private sector. So either we have that, or we will get something like Trump, which is already, showing its exceedingly authoritarian face vis-a-vis all these ICE forces that are being deployed without any reason whatsoever across American cities and particularly, democratic states and cities and so on. So these are the two options, but both of them are neoliberal options. I mean, Trump actually represents a neoliberal gone mad, where, the state itself, I mean, it encourages, but the state internalizes within itself elements of capital, and members of the capitalist class themselves become officials of the state and start wielding state power and so on.
Yeah, like the horror of people like Musk. I'm absolutely
exactly.
Before we get to a final question, I should just do again a little bit more housekeeping, and also thank everyone for listening in today, and thank our speaker too, Radhika Desai. As I said at the beginning, please do make a donation if you can, and hopefully you can purchase a Marx Matters series season ticket. Again, it's those sorts of donations, that sort of help that makes us able to put on these really awesome events, and do register too for our next event on Marx and Ireland, and for the Engels lecture too. So last question I will ask you, Radhika, and give you the last word is, I think actually one of the takeaway points from kind of reading your work and talking to you today is that none of these none of these things are settled questions. They're all about actually, the way capitalism operates isn't just a sort of structure that imposes itself on the world. It's from kind of decisions that the ruling class makes in order to kind of manage those contradictions. And the kind of counterpoint to that, I guess, is then there's us on the other side and what we do. And I think maybe perhaps the sort of paradox of the sort of internationalist politics that I've sometimes had to wrestle with. And I mean, not just kind of internationalists in terms of kind of offering solidarity with kind of struggle across the world, but also having that kind of global perspective at the core of your analysis, is that sometimes it can make those problems seem quite distant and like you don't have much control over them or power over them. So I guess my final question is, how can we overcome that sense? And what advice would you give to activists on maintaining that sort of big picture focus, whilst also ensuring that those big questions are the thing that are actually guiding our political action on the day to day, as it were?
Well, I mean, I think that that's a very good question, and I've I have a two-part answer to this question. I think that, I mean, obviously, well, let me rephrase. Let me start again. Part of the reason why the left finds itself on such a back foot is that in a certain way, it has also had its own version of neoliberalism. Because if you think about it, going back to the 70s and 80s, since that time, we have been talking about, in the West, we have been talking about forms of socialism in which the role of the party is a complete no-no. There should be no party. We should have some kind of network politics of decentralized institutions, etc., like social movements and NGOs and so on. And so, whereas if you had a party, it was bound to be Leninist, and this is bound to lead directly, do not pass go, do not collect anything, directly go to the gulag, etc. So we have been avoiding the issue of party. And the second issue we have been avoiding is the issue of planning. That is to say, you have to prepare to plan the economy, to plan for production, plan for the production of the things that people need, etc. And I think that, so really, we won't be able to, like, obviously the first part of any progress forward, and I think we can make progress fairly quickly, especially given how badly capitalism is now serving us, ordinary people, in Western countries. I think that if you begin to shed this, if you begin to get a better conception of the reality of actually existing socialism and of its real achievements, if you compare actually existing socialism to the first world countries, you're doing something wrong, because you're forgetting the 3 or 4 ways that I mentioned in which development today will have to be radically different from what first world countries have experienced in the past. They will not have the luxury of imperialism. They will have to deal with the problems created by imperialism, capitalism, etc. They will have to do it against the teeth, in the teeth of resistance by imperialism, etc. So in all of these ways, any development today in third world countries, in countries like China or Russia in the past, was never going to look like development looked in first world countries. So you have to take that into account and say, this is what, this is not to endorse everything that happened there, but to understand why it happened, how it happened, and so on. And I think unless we take those things seriously, I don't think we can advance, because we will never have the kind of organization we need to actually take power away from the existing ruling class, which is not, which is basically at this point in time, opportunistically making whatever profit it can, and not even worrying about the sustainability of these arrangements through which it is making profits, knowing kind of après moi le déluge, whatever happens, I'm going to benefit now and not worry about what happens next.
Thank you so much for today, Radhika. It was really great talking to you, and such a rich conversation. And I really hope that the viewers have enjoyed watching it too. And like I say, I'd encourage everyone to tune in for the rest of the Marx Matters series. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.